April 20th, 1999, Columbine High School. 20 injured, 13 killed. December 14th, 2012, Sandy Hook Elementary School. 2 injured, 26 killed. February 14th, 2018, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. 17 injured, 17 killed.
In 2018 alone, there have been 17 school shootings, and since 2013, there have been a staggering 290. These horrific and saddening statistics about gun violence in U.S. schools have shocked many into action. From student-run protests to legislation, people in all aspects of society are starting to do something. So how did it all start, and how should we tackle this momentous issue?
Almost everyone will agree that gun violence in schools is a large problem in American society. However, not everyone agrees on the cause or what to do about it. So how did it start? First, let's take a look into the amount of guns currently carried in America.
The Pew Research Center found that 42% of Americans live in a household with a gun. 3/4 of these owners claim that owning a gun is essential to their freedom. Among these people, the Small Arms Survey concluded that they collectively owned 393 million guns, in comparison to the almost 330 million people that we have living in our country.
Is the widespread ownership of guns and the easy access the issue? It may be part of the problem, but it's certainly a hasty generalization. In fact, Brooke from The Independent shows that Switzerland had a much higher rate of gun ownership than the US, while also having a much lower crime rate. Switzerland also hasn't had a mass shooting since 2001.
Given this fact, why can't the US be the same way? In fact, many corporations and people do want to keep guns around. However, even within this position, there are a lot of intricacies.
Let's start with the most hands-off approach and work down. This solution, mainly proposed by proponents in the gun industry, says to simply arm more people, whether it be teachers, guards, officers, or individuals. This approach wants to implement protection so as many people are able to protect themselves as possible.
The NRA even gives some specific guidelines as to how to approach this solution. Build more fencing to prevent easy access, grow shrubs away from the buildings, have specific entryway schematics at hand, and reinforce windows with ballistic glass and doors with steel plating.
They also want expulsion from school to be the beginning, not the end of the response when there are threats of weapons. But perhaps the most important and controversial step is to arm teachers and even hire school resource officers and security guards to protect the students. After teachers and school resource officers undergo firearm training, they would have the necessary skills to defuse and stop a dangerous situation. This method does make some sense. With Switzerland as a model, we can see that people can have guns and still be very safe.
In fact, the pictures you saw before are of Staff Sergeant Justin Hogg, who was the first Security Forces School Resource Officer in the Air Force. Here, we can see a real-life example of arming more people leading to better protection. However, one concern of many is the training of the SROs. While Sergeant Hogg has had military training, many would not, which leads to some concern. Interestingly, the hunting community has spoken out over this issue. While many think hunters are opposed to gun control, in actuality they do think that some form of controls are good. Particularly, they think that we should restrict the types of firearms available. Daniel M. Ash, former director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and a member of the hunting community, stated, quote, "We do not need AR-15s or any assault-style weapons to hunt game," end quote. This method would allow these hunters to still have easy access to guns, but only to certain types of guns needed for their lifestyle. Some other groups do share part of this sentiment, but they are still worried that people will take advantage of accessible guns.
In order to not to take these chances, a stricter method has been proposed by the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence, among others. These organizations directly oppose the NRA, and they seek to greatly restrict the amount of guns going out into society. This has two parts. First, more strict background checks will be implemented.
Instead of having only 1% of people getting denied, this number would be raised as the conditions for owning a gun are raised. Second, the types of guns which are available to citizens should be changed, just like what the hunting community wants. In fact, we have seen analogs of increasing regulations to prevent deaths before. The transportation industry is a great example. The Center for Disease Control reports that laws such as requiring manufacturers to make seatbelts and having strict driver's license controls have led to the decrease in 34 million deaths due to cars, which has now enabled gun violence to catch up to the lethality of traffic accidents. In the same sense, the CSGV seeks to force manufacturers to stop selling certain weapons and to enforce better checks. However, other problems are still raised.
Even if gun control was increased, would guns be gone from society? Statistics from the ATF show that, in fact, the same amount of guns might still be available. Their studies have shown that the most dangerous criminals don't get their guns through legal means and instead acquire them through the black market.
Although most school students cannot be considered dangerous criminals and are probably not involved with the black market, the accessibility to guns is still a large issue. This means that there is yet another problem to solve.
The US seems to have a large mental health issue. According to WHO, the US is one of the top 3 most depressed countries, alongside China and India, based on cases of anxiety, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder. In fact, around 1 in 5 adults in the US experience some form of mental illness each year. Unfortunately, only 41% of these adults actually receive treatment. For children, the Child Mind Institute shows that out of the 74 million living in the US, around 17 million have had a psychiatric disorder. This number is only growing.
How does this relate to guns? Well, perpetrators of mass shootings in schools and mental health issues have some correlation. Valsequel et al. Reports for the U.S. Department of Education that only 1/3 of school shooters received a mental health evaluation, while 17% were diagnosed with a mental disorder.
However, a disproportionate amount of these students, 78%, were found to have a history of suicide attempts or suicidal ideations prior to attack. In fact, a different study by Lee, a professor who analyzed school shootings, found similar evidence, with 61% of the attackers demonstrating a history of suicide attempts while also experiencing symptoms of extreme depression.
Specifically, Drs. James L. Knoll and George D. Annis found that there are certain biological characteristics common among mass shooters, including depression and psychosis. Other common psychological characteristics are negative self-image, paranoia, and fantasies of revenge.
Furthermore, a pattern of social characteristic is presented, including isolation and ostracism. The study purports that perpetrators often felt socially rejected and perceive society as continually denouncing them as unnecessary, ineffectual, and pathetic. So instead of bearing the burden of the humiliation, they plan a surprise attack to prove their hidden value.
The issues with mental health described previously provide some confounding variables to look at. Even with increased protection, would Americans really be able to use the guns for their intended purpose of defense, or would even more shootings happen?
The National Education Association proposes another solution, which shares the sentiments of teachers and students. They want to educate and improve infrastructure.
Many teachers have come together to support educating the youth about mental health and awareness. Campaigns on anti-bullying, inclusivity, and not being a bystander are spreading like wildfire. This idea to first solve the problem with mental health could very possibly lead to a solution, but it has its own flaws. Feasibility is one issue, and the connection of mental health to gun violence is another. Remember, although 71% of shooters show signs of mental illness, that still leaves 28% of people who don't.
None of these solutions are perfect. In fact, many of the groups who support a particular position are also constantly thinking of ways to incorporate different ideas. However, the difficulty of getting not only everyone to agree, but also be happy about agreeing is probably even more difficult than solving gun violence. With that being said, all of these positions and groups still hold the same core values. They're just going about it in different ways. Perhaps if one day people could peacefully talk about this issue, both sides could live happily ever after.